Good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Professor.
It seems that the Islamic State is thinking of taking over Pakistan and Afghanistan and competing with Al-Qaeda in India, and the situation between Putin and Ukraine seems to be uncertain, to put it mildly, but some people are optimistic and some people are pessimistic. But what I find particularly interesting about this is that the current situation should have coincided with the NATO summit. And I find the discussions in the NATO summit extremely interesting, because NATO's problem is it's an institution, and it has to show that it has a reason to exist. But what could its reason be? Is it going to go to war? I mean, what other reasons to exist does it have? But it doesn't really want to send troops anywhere. So it has a really big problem of how to reinvent itself in the current situation. And I think that's generally a problem of institutions as social change continues to accelerate, because they're established with guidelines and objectives and so on that belong to a different set of conditions. But I like what Obama seems to be doing. He seems to be using the occasion to go around and try to build a coalition. Now, just exactly what he has in mind for a coalition, I'm not sure. But as I've been trying to work out in my own head what would be a sensible way to deal with both the threat that the Islamic State poses and also the ridiculous level of violence that it's committing locally, both to people on the ground around it and also hostages that it has. And it's not an easy question to deal with. But I think a coalition of all the surrounding countries is probably the best way to start. The only problem with that is that some of the countries are people we like to work with, and some of the countries are people we don't want to work with. And it's even more complicated than that, because some of the countries we want to work with are good targets for ISIS, because they have lousy systems of government, even though we support them. And some of the countries we don't want to work with have relatively good systems of government.
Well, it's interesting, because the coalition against ISIS members was revealed today. The list is the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, Poland, Turkey. I believe there's one other, but it's a European country. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE have indicated they'll kick in financially. And then if you read further down, it indicates that they would rely on the Kurdish fighters and the Iraqi army fighters to do the groundwork, and they would lean on the Jordanians for intelligence, supposedly. That's the coalition. Now, again, your point's well taken. When I read the story, I was like, well, that's interesting. I mean, where are the neighboring countries? And where is Iran? Where is Pakistan? I mean, Syria, God forbid, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know exactly how effective this is going to be, but the interesting tone change is that the quote-unquote coalition is not talking about fighting ISIS or controlling ISIS. They're now talking about eradicating ISIS.
I wonder what eradication means.
Well, I think they're going to literally try to wipe them out. I mean, they've decided that they keep using this phrase, the cancer. You have to cut the cancer out and kill it. I mean, it's back to the.
And you know what happens then? It metastasizes.
Well, yes, one would think we would have learned that.
It's interesting that they should be talking about relying on the Kurds on one side and Jordan on the other side. The Kurds are probably very reliable, but it won't do them any good in the long term to appear to be the representatives of an outside coalition in that area, I would think, unless they get good support from Turkey, perhaps. And Turkey, and it's true that Turkey's relationship with the Kurds seems to be changing under Erdogan. But Jordan is much less reliable, and even though it has seemed very remarkably stable up to now under Hussein and his successor, this summer, and I think possibly earlier, though I don't keep up so well with what goes on in Jordan and some of the other countries, there have been the beginnings of movements that support things like the Islamic State. And just recently, there's been some quite serious things happening in Jordan. So Jordan has to be very careful because it's really not city is in the king more than anywhere else because of the division between the Palestinian part of the population and the Bedouin part of the population. But also the king is not exactly a model of future government.
No, no, he's somewhat perhaps more enlightened, although his father was quite enlightened. But he's got this bit of a populist touch. Apparently, he roams Amman at night with just one bodyguard. Shows up in hospital emergency rooms dressed in plain clothes and
something out of the Arabian Nights.
Yes, he does things like that. So yes. No, but Obama is going to speak today at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and I suppose he'll talk about the forming of the Rapid Reaction Force, which has now been approved, and he's presumably going to talk about the coalition with ISIS, against ISIS.
And the other thing that is going on at the level of rumors is a possible meeting between Sharif and Modi in New York.
Really?
Yes, because the sometime in probably the coming week, but I'm not sure of the date, a lot of national leaders will be assembling.
Sure, the UN General Assembly annual opening, right?
And that's often an occasion for a lot of interesting things to happen.
Yes. That's where the famous handshake between Obama and Raul Castro occurred. Yeah.
So there's all sorts of possibilities for high-level meetings in the next couple of weeks. But I'm glad to hear that Obama is going to make some sort of pronouncement about this, because if he can make a significant statement about America's decision what to do that is not the old-fashioned decision of sending the army, that will be, I think, important.
I must say, I'm very impressed with his caution and restraint.
But he has, I mean, his big problem is he's got to act sensibly, but also got to satisfy Congress, and it's very difficult to do both those things at the same time. There's a lot of people in Congress who are out to get him to begin with, and particularly want to be able to say that he's not he's reducing America's credibility by not showing enough force.
Well, again, as we often talk, I mean, it could well be said that that's simply an acknowledgement of the facts. Things have changed. This is not 50 years ago.
But there are a lot of people who don't acknowledge. And the idea I had today that I thought would help us understand all these things is, you know, I'm always talking about social variables that underlie what's actually going on. And it occurred to me, as I was thinking about this, that the social variables are always hidden. The significance of social variables are always hidden. That is, we think in terms of relationships, and we know how our relationships change, but the actual social variables that underlie the relationships, and in fact are the social matrix in which the relationships are embedded, and therefore when the matrix changes, the relationships change, we're not aware of. And I think that's the problem at the moment, that everybody's got their eyes fixed on relationships and how they change, whether they're domestic political relationships or international political relationships. But they're not looking at the underlying social metrics that produces this incredible rise of political awareness everywhere in the world, so that so many more people without information are informed about changes in relationships without understanding why they're changing. And that's what's causing the trouble.
That's an interesting observation. It's almost as if the facts of the situation have changed, but the relationships are still catching up.
Yeah.
So
I think generally, to go back to my favorite phrase, the crucial phase, we can't keep up in our efforts to adapt to the change that's going on in the social variables that we can't control. And especially the reason for that is that we depend upon institutions, and we expect institutions to be reliable as they are, but the institutions have to change in order to keep up with the changing social variables.
Well, let me posit this then. I mean, frankly, to go back to the opening discussion, what has NATO been doing for 20 years? I mean, it was founded in 1949 as a buttress against Soviet expansion. And the Soviet Union hasn't been around for 20 years. I mean,
It's been
but
recruiting new members.
Yes.
The Soviet Union's, the former Soviet Union's doorstep.
Yes.
Which is exactly the reason why there's a problem now between Russia and Ukraine.
That's right.
And that's what nobody seems to understand. And I'm surprised. I was thinking about this earlier today as well. It surprises me that Putin, who has, I think, written op-ed articles for the New York Times in the past, hasn't he?
I believe he has, yes.
Why doesn't he write an op-ed article for the New York Times explaining exactly what his motivation is?
Right, right.
Because I don't think anybody here understands, and it could be that he's saying this all the time in Russia and our media don't report it. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, but he's savvy enough to be able to get to the media when he wants to.
It's a fairly straightforward story. I mean, a huge 20-nation military bloc created to counteract the former the Soviet Union served its purpose. The Soviet Union no longer exists. I mean, Russia is a democracy, albeit an ineffectual one perhaps. And then meanwhile, NATO still continues to grow and expand and recruit former allies of the Soviet Union, and now is right up on its doorstep, on its borders. In fact, I believe Russia has applied or indicated that they would like to become NATO members, but we're told no. Is that correct? I think I remember that in the past 5 or 6 years.
I'm not sure about that. I don't remember the actual details, and I read something about recently that made me think that there was a talk about Russia not becoming a member, but having some sort of association with NATO.
Well, isn't that's almost heresy? I mean, that somewhere in the NATO charter, I'm sure it's vanilla enough that it does not mention the Soviet Union. It probably speaks about a commonality of interests, military mutual defense against common enemies. I mean, although I remember back in 1949, that was a tough era. It might specifically name Russia, but who knows?
Well, it would have been the Soviet Union anyway,
right.
rather than
Russia.
Right. To go back to what you were saying about what has NATO been doing all these decades, didn't they go to Afghanistan?
They went to Afghanistan. They bombed Kosovo. They've done some work along those.
Done things, and in fact, since 1991, when they obviously were not worried about the Soviet Union anymore, in fact, what they have become is the extension of American foreign policy. And that's why Russia is upset with NATO's actions, because it's very plain that NATO really manages to change America's mind, it's not really what should we say,
Right.
a democracy of equal members, even though, of course, they do have a new chair every year or every so often. It's still really an extension of American power.
Right. The military commander, I believe, is always an American.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty cogent argument. You're right. He should write an op-ed.
Maybe.
Maybe we should write it and send it to him for his consideration.
Well, maybe if he watches our video blog, he'll get the idea.
Well, we can always send him the link. Well, okay. All right. Well, Professor, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.